kids. I'm going to do this read aloud, and I sure hope I can keep up with it. It's a really big book, but it's so great. And so we're doing this read aloud in class, but there are always kids who are absent when we're doing all this online learning. And so I just want to make sure they have access to it. Plus, when we do writing, then they can quote from the text if they don't have their book with them. So anyway, this is the story of Johnny Tremain, a story of Boston in revolt by Esther Forbes. And I've read it a few times to my classes in the past, and I thought I would go ahead and give it a go. So just such a great story. I'm going to skip the introduction by Gary Schmidt. Thank you, Mr. Schmidt, but there are spoilers in there, and I don't want to spoil anything about this story. It's such a great story. Up and about. And these chapters are a bit long, so I'm only going to record one section at a time. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to stop and talk about important words and other things as we go through it. On rocky islands, gulls woke. Time to be about their business. Silently they floated in on the town, but when their icy eyes sighted the first dead fish, first bits of garbage about the ships and wharves, they began to scream and quarrel. The cocks in Boston backyards had long before cried the coming of day. Now the hens were also awake, scratching, clucking, laying eggs. Cats in malt houses, granaries, shipholds, mansions, and hovels caught a last mouse, settled down to wash their fur and sleep. Cats did not work by day. In stables, horses shook their halters and whinnied. In barns, cows lowed to be milked. Boston slowly opened its eyes, stretched and woke. The sun struck in horizontally from the east, flashing upon weather vanes, brass cocks and arrows. Here a glass-eyed Indian, there a copper grasshopper. And the bells in the steeples clanged, telling the people it was time to be up and about. And again, the bells in Boston, always about the bells. That should bring you back to the Paul Revere story. In hundreds of houses, sleepy women woke sleepier children. Get up and to work, Ephraim. Get to the pump, fetch mother water. Anne, get to the barn, milk the cow and drive her to the common. Start the fire, Silas. Put on a clean shirt, James. Dolly, if you aren't up before I count 10. And so, in a crooked little house at the head of Hancock's Wharf on crowded Fish Street, Mrs. Lapham stood at the foot of a ladder leading to the attic where her father-in-law's apprentices slept. These boys were luckier than most apprentices. Their master was too feeble to climb ladders, the middle-aged mistress too stout. It was only her bellows that could penetrate to their quarters, not her heavy hands. Boys? No answer. Dove? Coming, ma'am. Dove turned over for one more snooze. Frustrated, she shook the ladder. She was too heavy to climb. She wished she could shake them limbs of Satan. Dusty Miller, let me hear your voice. Here it is, piped Dusty pertly. Her voice changed to pleading. Johnny, you get them two lazy lug-a-beds up. Get them down here. You pull that worthless Dove right out her bed. You give Dusty a kick for me. I'm waiting for him to fetch fresh water so's I can get on with breakfast. Johnny Tremain was on his feet. He did not bother to answer his mistress. He turned to the fat, pale, almost white-haired boy, still wallowing in bed. Hear that, Dove? Oh, you. Leave me lay, can't you? Grumbling, he swung his legs out of the bed the three boys shared. Johnny was already in his leather breeches, pulling on his coarse shirt, tucking in the tails. He was a rather skinny boy, neither large nor small for 14. He had a thin, sleep-flushed face, light eyes, a wry mouth, and fair, lank hair. Although 2 years younger than the swinish Dove, inches shorter and pounds lighter, he knew, and old Mr. Lapham knew, busy Mrs. Lapham and her 4 daughters, and Dove and Dusty also knew that Johnny Tremain was boss of the attic and almost of the house. Dusty Miller was 11. It was easy for Johnny to say, "Look sharp, Dusty," and little Dusty looked sharp. But Dove, his first name had long ago been forgotten, hated the way the younger apprentice lorded it over him, telling him when to go to bed, when to get up, criticizing his work in the silversmith shop as though he were already a master smith. Hadn't he been working 4 years for Mr. Lapham and Johnny only 2? Why did the boy have to be so infernally smart with his hands and his tongue? "Look here, Johnny, I'm not getting up 'cause you tell me to. I'm getting up 'cause Mrs. Lapham tells me to." "All right," said Johnny blandly, "just so you're up." There was only one window in the attic. Johnny always stood before it as he dressed. He liked this view down the length of Hancock's Wharf, counting houses, shops, stores, sail lofts, and one great ship after another, home again after their voyaging, content as cows waiting to be milked. He watched the gulls, so fierce and beautiful, fighting and screaming among the ships. Beyond the wharf was the sea and the rocky islands where gulls nested. He knew to the fraction of a moment how long it would take the 2 other boys to get into their clothes. Swinging about, he leaped for the head of the ladder, hardly looking where he went. One of Dove's big feet got there first. Johnny stumbled, caught himself, and swung silently about at Dove. "Gosh, Johnny, I'm sorry," snickered Dove. "Sorry? You're going to be a lot sorrier. I just didn't notice. You do that again and I'll beat you up again, you overgrown pig of a louse, you." Okay, and I have to tell you, better not hear any of this language out on the playground. It's totally inappropriate. So it's just showing the relationship. This is an antagonistic relationship between Dove and Johnny. Okay, he's insulting him. And then also the way that Dove is described by the author. It's you as a reader are supposed to be thinking, that's all negative about Dove, and Johnny is supposed to be like, really talented, and he's really active and smart, and he's responsible. And so it's really just the comparison between these two. And then Dove is really badgering Johnny, and he trips him when Johnny's trying to get to the top of the attic ladder and get down. So you can see that they have a very adversarial relationship. He went on from there. Mr. Lapham was strict about his boys swearing, but Johnny could get along very well without. Whatever a pig of a louse was, it did describe the whitish, flaccid, parasitic Dove. Parasitic being one of our vocabulary words for this week. So just a really quick parasitic, taking from someone and doing nothing to earn or deserve it, like a parasite, like a tick or a mosquito. Little Dusty froze as the older boys quarreled. He knew Johnny could beat up Dove any time he chose. He worshipped Johnny and did not like Dove, but he and Dove were bound together by their common servitude to Johnny's autocratic rule. It's like he's a dictator. Half of Dusty sympathized with one boy, half of him with the other, in this quarrel. It seemed to him that everybody liked Johnny. Old Mr. Lapham because he was so clever at his work. Mrs. Lapham because he was reliable. The 4 Lapham girls because he sassed them so, and then grinned. Most of the boys in the other shops around Hancock's Wharf liked Johnny, although some of them fought him on sight. Only Dove hated him. Sometimes he would get Dusty in a corner, tell him in a hoarse whisper how he was going to get a pair of scissors and cut out Johnny Tremain's heart. But he never dared to do more than trip him, and then whine out of it. "Someday," said Johnny, his good nature restored, "I'll kill you, Dove. In the meantime, you have your uses. You get out the buckets and run to North Square and fetch back drinking water." Now, the Laphams were on the edge of the sea. Their well was brackish, and if you don't know what that means, you think about where Pocahontas and Jamestown was located. Jamestown was located right next to the sea, and that meant that salt water was in their well. So brackish means it's too salty. You can't drink the water because it's like drinking seawater. You have to get well water that's groundwater that's fresh from rain runoff. Look here, Mrs. Lapham said Dusty was to go and get along with you. Don't you go arguing with me. Fetching water, sweeping, helping in the kitchen, tending the annealing furnace in the shop were the unskilled work the boys did. Already Johnny was so useful at his bench, he could never be spared for such labor. It was over a year since he had carried charcoal or a bucket of water, touched a broom, or helped Mrs. Lapham brew ale. His ability made him semi-sacred. He knew his power and reveled in it. He could have easily made friends with stupid Dove, for Dove was lonely and admired Johnny as well as envied him. Johnny preferred to bully him. Johnny, followed by his subdued slaves, they're not really slaves, it's just, of course, the two other boys who don't really have a whole lot of confidence, slipped down the ladder with an easy flop. To his left was Mr. Lapham's bedroom. The door was closed. Old Master did not go to work these days until after breakfast. Starting the boys off, getting things going, he left to his bustling daughter-in-law. Johnny knew the old man, whom he liked, was already up and dressed. He took this time every day to read the Bible. To his right, the only other bedroom was open. It was here Mrs. Lapham slept with her 4 poor fatherless girls, as she called them. The 2 biggest and most capable were already in the kitchen helping their mother. And then I do have a little character analysis so that you guys can kind of get comfortable with who these characters are. And you should probably know right now that Mr. Lapham had a son who married Mrs. Lapham. So when you think about Mr. Lapham, he owns the shop. He had a son who has died. Mrs. Lapham has these daughters, which we'll get to in a minute, but so Mrs. Lapham is not Mr. Lapham's wife. She's his daughter-in-law, okay? The 2 biggest were most capable were already in the kitchen helping their mother. Scylla was sitting on the edge of one of the unmade beds brushing Isana's hair. It was wonderful hair, seemingly spun out of gold. It was the most wonderful thing in the whole house. Gently Scylla brushed and brushed, her little oddly shaped face turned away, pretending she did not know that Johnny was there. He knew neither Scylla nor Isana would politely wish him the conventional good morning. He was lingering for his morning insult. Scylla never lifted her eyes as she put down her brush and very deliberately picked up a hair ribbon. The Laphams couldn't afford such luxuries, but somehow Scylla always managed to keep her little sister in hair ribbons. Very carefully she began to tie the child's halo of pale curls. She spoke to Isana in so low a voice it was almost a whisper. "There goes that wonderful Johnny Tremain." Isana took her cue, already so excited that she was jumping up and down. "Johnny worth his weight in gold, Tremain." "If you don't think he is wonderful, ask him, Isana." "Oh, just how wonderful are you, Johnny?" Johnny said nothing, stood there and grinned. The 2 youngest Laphams were always insulting him, not only about how smart he was, but how smart he thought he was. He didn't care. Every now and then they would say something that irritated him, and then together they would shout, "Johnny's mad!" As an apprentice, he was little more than a slave until he had served his master 7 years. He had no wages. The very clothes upon his back belonged to his master, but he did not, as he himself said, take much. There were only 4 real rooms in the Lapham house, the 2 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, the kitchen and the workshop on the 1st. Johnny paused in the lower entry. In the kitchen he could see his formidable mistress, bent double over the hearth. This is where they cook things. Madge, in time, would look like her mother, but at 18, she's 18 years old, she was handsome in a coarse-grained, red-faced, thick-waisted way. Dorcas was 16, built like Madge, but not so loud-voiced, nor as roughly good-natured. Poor Dorcas thirsted for elegance. She would rub flour on her face, trying to look pale, like the fashionable ladies she saw on the street. She wore her clothes so tight, hoping to look ethereal. She looked apoplectic. Oh dear, it's kind of like she's trying to fit in with the upper class, but they are not upper class, and she looks as though she's had a stroke, perhaps. How they all had laughed when her stays burst in the middle of a meeting with a loud pop. Her stays, like her corset, the things that all wound up tight and cinched in. She did not call her mother Ma, but Mother, or Respected Mother. And in her efforts to avoid the rough, easy speech of her associates on Hancock's Wharf, she talked, when she remembered it, in a painfully prissy, proper way. Johnny thought Madge pretty bad, and Dorcas even worse, but he was philosophical about them. He just doesn't really think too much about them. He wouldn't mind having them for sisters. They certainly were good, hard workers, except when Dorcas tried too hard to be elegant. It had already been decided that when he grew up to be a really great silversmith, as Mr. Lapham said he was to marry Scylla, and together they would inherit Grandpa's silver business. Scylla was just his age, that means 14. This idea seemed only mildly offensive, to both of them. Johnny had no particular objections. And if you think, oh, that's weird, it's like they're being fixed up when they're 14, well, think about people didn't really get married a lot of the time for love. It was because of convenience or necessity back then. Johnny had no particular objections. Oh, there go the lights again. Whee! Get the lights back on. Hello. Okay, sorry about that. That's just par for the course. Smart apprentices were always getting ahead by marrying into their masters' families. He had been flattered when Mrs. Lapham had told him that he might marry one of her girls. Of course, Madge and Dorcas, they were fine, big, buxom girls, would make better wives. But didn't he think they were a little old for him? True, Scylla was just a mite spindly, but she was coming along fine. Isana was so weakly it didn't seem worth making any plans for her maturity. So it was to be Scylla. He thinks, she's probably not going to grow up. Too old, she'll probably die. Isn't that sad? But, back then, it would take a flu or something and it would wipe people out. Johnny had often heard Mrs. Lapham say that Isana was hardly worth the bother she was to raise. The little girl, her beautiful brown eyes wide with interest, never seemed to mind these remarks of her mother, but they made Scylla cry. Scylla loved Isana. She was proud when people stopped her on the street and said, "Is that little angel your sister?" She did not mind that there were so many things Isana could not keep down, like pork gravy, mince pies, new beer. If Isana got wet, she had a cold. If a cold, a fever. First, Johnny, with a customary "look sharp," got the sulky dove and his buckets headed for North Square. Then he took the key to the shop out of his pocket as though he owned it. Dusty, good and quiet as a mouse, followed him. "Look sharp, Dusty," Johnny said. "Get the annealing furnace going. Get to the coal house. Fetch in charcoal. You'll have to do it by yourself. I want to get this buckle mended before breakfast." Already the day's bustle had begun up and down the wharf. A man was crying, "Fish!" Sailors were heave-hoing at their ropes. A woman was yelling that her son had fallen into the water. A parrot said distinctly, "King Hancock." Johnny could smell hemp and spices, tar and salt water, the sun drying fish. He liked his wharf. He sat at his own bench, before him the innumerable tools of his trade. The tools fitted into his strong, thin hands. His hands fitted the tools. Mr. Lapham was always telling him to give God thanks, who had seen fit to make him so good an artisan. not to take it out in lording it over the other boys. That was one of the things Johnny did not let bother him much. Dove came back, his thick lower lip thrust out like pouting. The water had slopped over his breeches down his legs. Mrs. Lapham does not want you in the kitchen. Johnny did not even look up from his buckle. Nah. Well, then this spoon you finished yesterday afternoon has to be melted down, made over. You beat it to the wrong gauge. That's Johnny speaking. Did Mr. Lapham say 'twas wrong? No, but it is. It is supposed to match this spoon. Look at it. Dove looked. There was no argument. So, get out a crucible. Soon as Dusty's got the furnace going, you melt it down and try again. I'd like to get you in a crucible, thought Dove, and melt you down. I'd beat you to the proper gauge. 2 years younger than me, and look at him. It was Isana who ran in to tell them that Grandpa was in his chair and breakfast was on the table. The soft brown eyes combined oddly with the flying fair hair. She did look rather like a little angel, Johnny thought, just as people were always telling Scylla on the street, and so graceful. She seemed to float about rather than run. No one to see her would ever guess the number of things she couldn't keep down. So, she is not very healthy. Anyhow, that's the end of section 1 and the end of this video. See you on the next one.